Hello, and welcome to another episode of Such a Nightmare, Conversations About Horror. My name is Katherine Troyer, and I'm delighted, as I am always delighted, to be joined by Anthony Tresca.
Hey there.
This is a podcast where the horrifically nerdy meets the terrifyingly academic, as we explore that fine line between the horrific and the horrible. Each episode looks at a specific horror text that is, for better or worse, giving us nightmares.
And we are so excited to have you join us today for our episode on the Final Girl Support Group by Grady Hendrix.
I feel like there's something about the title that I can never get quite right, and I just end up having to call it like Final Girl because I don't know if it's I think it's group and support that I keep wanting to put into different orders, but it's the title the book needs, right? But it's really hard for me to say it correctly every time.
The title the book needs, but a mouthful that you care not for.
Yeah, pretty much. Slash, I just can't remember it. So somewhere in between, it just doesn't fit right in my mouth, and maybe I just need to start exercising my little membrane muscles a little bit more. So we try every so often to talk about books because both Anthony and I are readers, and horror fiction is interesting.
It really is. It's a whole separate thing than its counterpart in film. Film is going through horror films right now are going through a very different moment than what's going on in horror books.
Yes.
Similar, and I guess that they're both largely linked to trauma, but
yes,
what they're exploring and how they're doing it are vastly different.
And there are things happening in horror fiction that we haven't quite been able to fully get to in terms of horror film, primarily in terms of our creators, right? We are experiencing, in part due to self-publishing options and smaller presses, but also just, I think, more options, right? We have a more diverse, I think, horror writer community than we do, certainly, the big producers and directors that are, like, making the big budget films. We have plenty of low budget, I think, directors and writers that are not just white men. But we are getting to see more of that in fiction. And we're finally, like, in this moment that's really delightful where we're like, Stephen King is not the only one writing horror, ... And that to me is one of the most interesting parts about what's happening right now in horror literature.
And Grady Hendrix is, albeit not the most diverse pick of all of the current horror writers, but he's certainly an interesting horror writer, given this kind of, like, new sudden burst of a whole bunch of different, like, writers all popping up, and they're all kind of talking about similar issues right now. Like, this book joins Stephen Grant Jones' discussion of the larger discussion of Final Girls that was started a couple of years ago by a book that they both reference. I think it's just called Final Girl. So this has been a thing. This conversation about Final Girls is an ongoing open conversation in books right now, and that's fascinating.
It is. And we will be doing an episode on Stephen Graham Jones's My Heart is a Chainsaw to see how these two texts that are coming out pretty much at the same time, but with very different perspectives. Did they come out in the same month?
Not the same month, but they came out a month apart from each other. So Final Girl Support Group came out in July, and then the very next month of 2021, in August, Stephen Graham Jones' My Heart is a Chainsaw drops.
And part of the reason we're doing Grady Hendrix is that he falls into that sweet spot that has from the start defined the thing that both Anthony and I really, really like, and that is horror comedy. Although I will tell you something really interesting. I had a conversation with my class because they were reading Southern... Okay, so apparently none of his titles I can pronounce correctly. The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires. And I made a comment to my students about it being comedy, and they were like, it is? And I was like, are you asking? And they were like, we didn't think it was funny. And I was like, it's not funny, haha. And so then we had to have a discussion, and so that was a really illuminating conversation to realize that, like, how I'm defining horror comedy, at least when it comes to Hendrix, is very different than how other people apparently define comedy.
And I think maybe it's because the further you go in Grady Hendrix' lineup of books, the less of horror, explicitly horror and comedy they both are. Like this book, which I will get into a full discussion of properly in a moment, but this book is probably the least comedic of anything he's ever written to date. And it's an absolute turn in terms of his writing maturity from, I mean, just thinking about where he came from with Horror Store, his very first novel about what if IKEA was evil.
And I like that book, but it is very straightforward, right? Like, it's very simplistic, and not in a bad way, but in a, like you said, it's not as mature, because he basically takes all the things you expect to see, I mean, down to, like, the types of torture, and is like, I'm going to put them in here, but I'm going to put them in here with this sort of tongue-in-cheek. And so I think you're right. Maybe a better phrase of, or a better way of thinking about Hendrix is not through the lens of comedy, so much as just meta-narrative, which it's hard to have something that's meta-narrative that isn't at least a little tongue-in-cheek, but tongue-in-cheek is not necessarily the same as comedy. Certainly not the same as horror film comedy, which is not really manageable, right? You can't really do the shticky type stuff successfully in literature, which is why I think students probably don't read it as funny in the same way that, like, Shaun of the Dead or Happy Death Day is funny.
Yeah, when in reality they're playing with a lot of the same things, but just that difference in medium does not allow, maybe I guess the comic bits to read as explicitly bits, perhaps.
So we're going to try something new, which I'm really excited about, and that is that just in case it's been a little bit since you've read this book, or in case you're using this to kind of judge whether or not you want to read this book, listening to this episode, we're going to do, and by we, I mean Anthony. Anthony's going to give us a plot summary just to kind of remind you of some of the highlights, or to let you know the things that he thinks are going to be important for you to remember before we start our conversation as we traditionally do. So, Anthony.
Well, the Final Girl support group is about Lynette, who is a real-life final girl who survived a massacre 22 years ago, and it has permanently traumatized her. But don't worry, she's not alone. For more than a decade, she's been meeting with other actual final girls and a therapist in a support group for those who have survived the unthinkable. Lynette lived through a situation dubbed the Silent Night Slayings by the media, and she's in the support group with Adrian, a camp counselor who survived a killer who claimed he was seeking revenge for a non-existent son, Marilyn, who was attacked by bloodthirsty cannibals, Danny, whose brother Nick escaped from a mental asylum on Halloween and slaughtered anyone who stood between him and his sister, Julia, who was left a final girl after her boyfriend and one of his friends decided to turn her into a final girl, and Heather, who's had to face a mysterious dream killer. Lynette is barely hanging on, and the others are not much better. The support group is one of the only things that can convince Lynette to leave the safety of her apartment. However, Lynette's worst fears are realized when Adrian is found murdered in her home. Lynette is certain that someone is out to finish the work that their respective killers failed at, to kill all final girls once and for all.
Hey, that was a lovely, like, spoiler-free one. And now we can just spoiler everything as we talk moving forward. I think what was particularly lovely about that plot summary is the reminder of the who's in the support group, right? And what films they are very clearly referencing or connecting to. Where the comedy comes from for me, right, is that, you know, there are these references to things that I know, oh yeah, this is actually, you know, for example, Heather and the Dream King is very clearly Nightmare on Elm Street because, hello, dreams, but also the character's name is Heather. But can we go through and just kind of, like, talk about what each one of them is supposed to correspond to the real life franchise?
Yeah. So we've already started with Heather, so I guess we can just go in reverse order then. So next up, we've got Julia, who's the final girl whose boyfriend and her friend decide to turn her into a final girl, which is pretty explicitly a reference to Scream.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that the franchise for them is even called Stab, right?
It's called Stab.
Which is the name of the fake movie in the Scream franchise.
So that's a lovely little detail that Hendrix has put in there for us. We've got Danny, who is the one who's escaping a Halloween killer.
Yeah.
So I wonder which possible Halloween
Tell
franchise
me more,
they could
Anthony.
be referring to. Then you've got Marilyn, who is attacked by cannibals, which is, Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Yeah, there's multiple references to her being from Texas, and the title of the made-up slayings in the book.
Panhandle Meat Hook.
Yeah, thank you. Panhandle Meat Hook. So again, another pretty clear reference.
Then we've got Adrian, who is the camp counselor, who was killed in killings very similar to the Friday the 13th killings. And then, of course, we've got Lynette, who was the one that this is the franchise that the Silent Night slayings that I personally knew the least about. Originally, I thought it was a reference to Black Christmas.
Yeah, I kept trying to make it fit with Black Christmas, and it kept obviously not fitting.
Yeah, because I was like, where are the sororities?
Right.
Why is she in high school?
Right.
What's going on? So it's actually a reference to a different Christmas-themed slasher, Silent Night, Deadly Night, which is about an orphan who's raised by nuns who grows up to be a killer toy Santa Claus. And Hendrix talks about how he knew he wanted to do this one because he wanted to have a killer Santa Claus. Pretty good reason.
And you earlier said, and I still very much agree with you, that, of Hendrix's book, this is the least, ha-ha funny, but where the humor comes in is in all of these Easter eggs, right? There's a brief reference to people whose last names are names of well-known horror writers, or at least his contemporaries. Tremblay's last name is used at least once. Graham Jones's name is in there once.
A couple references to King, obviously, in here. And then just, a plethora of other horror franchises get little name drops. Black Christmas is referenced. There's some weird ones about those trolley kind of horror movies, and the references to Gnome coming in this novel. And so he's just giving us anyone who knows even just a little bit about horror, no matter your knowledge, because Hendrix himself clearly has done so much research and knows so much about horror, he's able to be it doesn't matter if you get all of them, you'll at least get one of them.
Right. So before we get into the scholarship for today, which is very unsurprisingly going to be about the final girl, as Anthony said when I said that was what we were going to be talking about, he was like, we could do something else, but that would be a decision.
It would be a decision.
And so we're doing Final Girl. We're going to talk about that in a second. But before we get there, I wanted to make clear one of the really interesting aspects of this book, and that is that in this world, what Hendrix is suggesting is that there are these real life killings that are happening, and then people are excited about that and they're franchising it, right? Which he could have just had a story that was about all of the fictional characters getting together and being no, in my franchise we did this. But instead he's saying, no, actually, I want this to be that these are actual people in the real world, that the killings are happening in the real world, and then it's just being sensationalized, which, to be perfectly honest, is not that much different from true crime podcasts, true crime documentaries. And oftentimes we don't do, here is the explicit characters that we are basing the story off of, but we've talked a lot about horror's tendency to do the based on true events, inspired by true events. Everything from The Strangers, which was just one time there were some B&Es happening, to the Conjuring franchise, right? Where we're having the Warren family who are talking about actual cases that they went on. So this is not an unrealistic phenomenon. In fact, this is a very real one, but it's a really creative way to do this book.
It's very similar and more, it feels like just a fleshed out version of Wes Craven's New Nightmare, and the idea that it is the franchise that is so scary. What
Yes.
happens once someone has become a part of something that elevates them to this high status, but it's also about horrifying, grisly murders. And Hendrix himself references this New Nightmare connection several times in interviews outside, and just talking about how he was like, that was a huge inspiration for this book. And also he references it explicitly in the text. One of the chapter titles is New Nightmare in here. So it's like clearly that is a text that was on his mind when he was creating this book.
And he also talks at the very end in his, I think it's his acknowledgement section at the very back of the book, that one of the things that caught his attention, or one of the sources of inspiration, had to do with Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. So when Psycho came out, Hitchcock was able to do several things that hopefully we wouldn't be able to get away with today, including he bought every copy he could find of Bloch's book Psycho so that no one who came to see the film had a chance to read the book. Hendrix also talks about the fact that Hitchcock also bought the rights to someone's life story. And so, we have this actual historical precedent of this happening. And again, Hitchcock, no matter how lovely of films he made, was not a very good human being. So it's really not surprising he did some of the things he did. But I think that's one of the things, to go back to your point of make New Nightmare the scariest thing as the franchise. I think that's what makes this book so fundamentally disturbing, because it's saying any of us and all of us are products, or can potentially be products in a world that believes that everything is for sale.
It's that combined with the usurping of the classic idea that all media rests on, which is that once it's over, and then everything is, most of the time you like to wrap it up, and Hollywood loves to put a little good happy ending on it. And this says, okay, so what happened? But what happens next? Why, if everything we've just watched previously has been horrifying and bad, why wouldn't what happens next also be horrifying and bad? And this book is well, it is. It is bad.
And I think, to go back to what you were saying about Wes Craven, I think Wes Craven is perhaps one of the best in terms of franchise in acknowledging this, because in a lot of the other franchises, either because there's not a continuous final girl, or there is, but each film is ignoring the previous film. It's not there. The subsequent films in a franchise are not really about trauma, but both Scream and Nightmare on Elm Street are about trauma. They're about the trauma of living, which is just as horrific as the trauma of having been murdered. And so I think you're absolutely correct that this allows us to explore a really important question, and to go to something that slashers are not really interested in, right? Slashers are interested in destroying bodies. They are not really interested in trauma as a concept.
Yeah, Lynette has a great line in this book where she's talking about how she kind of had to stop watching Adrian's films at one point, because 20 minutes in, because they weren't focusing any times on the victims. They were merely just body bags to be killed and gutted, moving on through the rest of the killings. And I thought that, well, maybe is one of the quieter moments, because not technically a lot happening. You're just reading Lynette's thoughts. But I think it speaks to a real theme of this book, is why don't we care about victims?
Yes.
Why do, or perhaps more sad, why do we only care about victims when they're dying or already dead? None of the events before, after, it's only that one moment.
Yes. And this is a question that other horror people have been wrestling with. Joss Whedon and all of his grossness, and Drew Goddard, when they created The Cabin in the Woods, one of the questions they were asking themselves was, why do we keep repeating this ritual, this formula? Why do we keep enacting the same killing of the same types of people again and again and again? And of course, in Cabin in the Woods, it has to do with a shadowy underworld organization.
Right.
But it is something that I think Hendrix is touching on.
And Hendrix would never do the shadowy organization, at least not in this book, because it doesn't necessarily fit the vibe of this novel. I think it would feel untruthful.
Yes. So in in the shadowy underworld, right, we can place the blame on these ancient powers, right?
Yeah.
And we are all just trying to survive and appease them. And that is an interesting angle, but Hendrix, you're right, is saying, no, we are the problem. 100% it's us. Just remember that. It's us.
Because that one, it tries to, like, absolve some of the responsibility until kind of the very end, when it does some, like, oh, no, maybe, it was kind of their faults, and this is all bad. But this one, the whole time, is just like, no, everyone is responsible for their own actions all the time.
Yes. Everyone's responsible, and if we consume, I always think about, like, why zombies works is such a powerful metaphor, right? And it's because all of us are consumers, and many of us are mindless consumers. And there are no zombies in Hendrix's book, but that is his argument, right? Is that consumers are just as responsible in this world as the person wielding the knife, right? Because we are every time saying, pick that knife back up. And I think that might be one of the reasons why this book doesn't read as comedic as his earlier ones, because he's increasingly becoming a disaffirmative author.
Yeah.
In Horror Store, it's like, oh, but it's this creeper. Don't worry, we'll destroy the creeper. And, IKEA. And then starting with We Sold Our Souls and moving onward, then increasingly there have been like, well, maybe the problem's a little bit us or the system or culture. But then by the time we get to this one, he's not saying maybe. He's just saying it is, right?
Yeah.
In Southern Book Club Guide, in this one, he was like, no, the problem is the culture we've created that allows monsters to exist like this. Mm-hmm. Plain and simple.
Let's go in and let's just, like, I think you're going to reference the classic Final Girl scholarship, Clover. So
yeah.
Let's briefly just, I think, bring Clover in. This is a good moment for her to speak. She's talking, because I think she would fit right into this conversation we're having right now.
Oh, 100%. So Carol J. Clover wrote a book called Men, Women, and Chainsaws, Gender in the Modern Horror Film.
I got that book for one of my parents for Christmas one time.
Oh, that's nice. I'm glad that your parents have accepted.
I came out as a horror fan, and they accepted me.
Yeah. That's so funny. Yeah, my mom's still a little sad, but also she started being like, no, it's okay now. So this book originally came out in 1992, and it's been a really foundational text in horror studies, because she was publishing a book-length project on horror scholarship back before that was even something people thought was something we needed. And she has an entire chapter that's on slasher films specifically, and the chapter is called Her Body Himself, because she's going to be talking a lot about gender. She begins this chapter, though, I think it's funny, by saying, at the bottom of the horror heap lies the slasher film. And, she's talking about, she talks about the various components of a slasher film, and she talks about victims, and she talks about the terrible place. She talks about weapons. She talks about the killer. But she has a whole section on the term that she coined, that is Final Girl. She says, the image of the distressed female most likely to linger in memory is the image of the one who did not die, the survivor, or Final Girl. She is the one who encounters the mutilated bodies of her friends and perceives the full extent of the preceding horror and of her own peril, who is chased, cornered, wounded, whom we see scream, stagger, fall, rise, and scream again. She is abject terror personified. If her friends knew they were about to die only seconds before the event, the Final Girl lives with the knowledge for long minutes or hours. She alone looks death in the face, but she alone also finds the strength either to stay the killer long enough to be rescued, which is one type of ending she says happens, or to kill him herself, which is the second option for slasher film endings. Okay, so the Final Girl. She says, first and foremost, it's someone who survives, but I like that phrase of it is terror abject personified, because that's really important. Then she talks about the fact that, so we have this female hero, but the slasher films, which she's primarily writing about, are very clearly meant for a male audience. And so she says, so how are we supposed to wrestle with this fact that the person that we are rooting for, the I, for male audiences is a female character. And this is where it starts to get really interesting. And this is where I feel like Hendrix really did his research. She's asking, like, but if viewers can identify across gender lines, and if the root experience of horror is sex blind, are the screen sexes not interchangeable? Why are there not more and better female killers? And why, in light of the maleness of the majority audience, are there not more Pauls as well as Paulines? And so her argument is because the final girl does something really, really interesting. And that is that the final girl, she says, the gender of the final girl is likewise compromised from the outset by her masculine interests, her inevitable sexual reluctance, her apartness from other girls, sometimes her name. At the level of the cinematic apparatus, her unfemininity is signaled clearly by her exercise of the active, investigating gaze, normally reserved for males and punished in females when they assume it themselves. Tentatively at first and then aggressively, the final girl looks for the killer, even tracking him to his forest hut or his underground labyrinth, and then at him, therewith bringing him, often for the first time, into our vision as well. And so she talks about the fact that there's this way in which the final girl has this sort of shared masculinity because, you know, there's all these, like, phallic representations, but also there's a shared femininity because of this moment of, and she's going to go real Freudian, the castration, literal or symbolic, of the killer at her hands. Because remember that Freud said that, you know, women are really sad that we don't have phalluses, phallic. I don't know what's plural for phallus. Phalluses? Penises. We don't have peni. We don't have peni. And so, you know, that is the thing that makes us really sad. So she goes further and she says the final girl is on reflection a congenial double for the adolescent male, feminine enough to act out in a gratifying way, a way unapproved for adult males, the terrors and masochistic pleasures of the underlying fantasy, but not so feminine as to disturb the structures of male competence and sexuality. So essentially, men can identify with her and be like, oh, it's okay that she's scared because she's a woman, but I'm going to kind of follow her anyway. But then she says something else, but I want to pause there because there's one other really, really important thing that will set us up for the conclusion. But let's just pause there. So what caught your attention in all of that about the final girl?
I guess the discussion of the masculine, feminine, and most of the rooting of, I mean, most of the characters, all of the characters in here they go with the clear feminine route. There are a couple notable exceptions, which even kind of acknowledges Julia Campbell, a reference to Bruce Campbell, one of the few final guys, I guess, or final girl in the first one. Then he transitions to more of that, like, man in the second one to be a final guy.
Or I would even say by the second one he's just a hero, right? Like he's lost that essence of the final girl.
So I thought that was a clever. It was a funny reference to be able to include that in. Clearly Hendrix is thinking clearly about this. And I think it's really it's so clear, like throughout the book, he references other scholarship in the little sections. And you hear, throughout, when you were reading some of those phrases, you're like, there's absolutely no way that he didn't include some of that. Like early on, he references this academic person who was just like who was also talking about the gender issues in these slasher films as well.
I really liked the ephemera that he included, you know, between chapters where it was a snippet from a made-up scholar, a snippet from a news article, or a file, or whatever it might be. I'm always a big fan of that, of like that multi-modal approach. That was one of the things I really liked about Head Full of Ghosts as well.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, I just like it when there's imaginary documents from this imaginary world.
And I loved it because it was so much of the novel is through Lynette's like POV that you do get sucked into her perception of the world, which Hendrix reminds you constantly through some of those documents is not an entirely accurate reading of what's going on. Like particularly when you're referencing like when you get to read the news articles where you've just heard Lynette tell her story for like 100 pages, but then you're like, wait a second, everything she just said was only a half truth, and this is what she's thinking in her mind, and it just gives you a broader picture into what kind of a world, what the trauma has done to Lynette's mind, and how it is affecting her perception of reality in the world. And I just love that, reading her therapist's assessment of the whole situation, where it completely reframes every single thing that Lynette has previously established to you as the reader. It's a good twist without even really being, it's not even a twist, because it doesn't change any of the narrative. It's just that wasn't quite the full truth.
Right. This is an unreliable narrator, and I think we all know that she's an unreliable narrator about the time that she's talking to her plant. Right? It's not very far in that you're like, I bet she's a little unhinged. But I think that there's a moment in the narrative that is then supported by the ephemera that really cements that, and that's when she's like, oh, we come to group every time because Heather's can't survive without us. And then they were all like, no, Lynette, we come to group for you. You're the one we're most worried about. And, and then she dismisses it. But we get to see, like you said, through the ephemera, that is actually very true. And I think it's a very creative and clever way to show us the degree to which our narrator is unreliable. And not unreliable because she's being intentionally devious, but because trauma has colored everything in such a profound way.
And there's a lot, so that she's just very ashamed of. And so rather than dealing with it head on, it's just compartmentalize and move on, which doesn't completely remove the situation, but it does certainly make it easier for her to go on with her day, even if it is a day in pain, mostly.
One of the things that's interesting about this book, and I think that your earlier reference to New Nightmare is really apt in this case, is that part of this book is asking us to consider, is there ever a moment that a final girl can become a woman, right, as opposed to a girl? And what does that mean in terms of claiming agency, right? And what does that mean in terms of becoming the primary character in your own narrative as opposed to, the survivor of someone else's? And we see glimpses of that, but we also, of course, are seeing that everyone is stunted by their trauma. But to go back to Clover, right? So part of Clover's argument is that it may seem on the surface like it's really odd to have female main characters or female survivors besides our killer in these slasher texts. But really, she's saying it's not that surprising, because what the final girl is doing is that she's safe enough for for the male audience to be like, oh, well, she's not overly feminine, so I don't have to worry about that, so I can identify with her, but it's also okay that she's screaming and scared because she's a woman, right, as opposed to a man. And this is one of the areas that I don't think Hendrix is trying to do much subversion, right? He's presenting us with pretty traditional final girls. We have a lesbian, so that is, and lesbianism is so often coded through the male gaze anyway, right? And we never see them together, so it's never truly homoerotic. It's just a female love interest. We have multiple characters that have very masculine names. There are multiple times that Lynette is just shortened to Lynn, very intentionally.
Adrian, Danny.
Yes. Even in the case of Marilyn, who is set up to be, we learn that she was on the beauty pageant circuit, and she's married. She's been married a couple of times. We never see her husband. We never see her interacting as a wife. We just see her drinking and being wealthy.
Yeah.
And so all of the sort of things that these characters are doing is coded as the Clover's definition of the, quote, safe space that is the final girl, because she's not feminine, but she's also not so masculine that you're like, suck it up, soldier.
It takes the approach that the final girl really means outsider, because they can never be on the inside of any group. They're not clearly in line with any gender binary. They're not clearly accepted into any other groups. And because particularly in this group talks about how their trauma has further isolated them, not only because of the event itself, but because of how their trauma has been replicated from profit and mass produced and distributed on the world, that for only further elevated but isolated them and creates them as they're just outsiders in this book. And it's exploring that idea.
So the last couple of things that I want to bring in about Clover, because what I like about Clover is that she's acknowledging in this chapter that it's really weird and complicated, because on the one hand, shouldn't it be a sign of a subversive text or a subversive trend if our main characters are always female, if the male audience is always supposed to identify in a female from a female perspective, and then it's like, yeah, but only a little, but also a lot, right? And so she's really wrestling with this. So she talks about the fact that what's interesting about the final girl is that the final girl becomes her own savior. She becomes a hero. And the moment that she becomes a hero is the moment that the male viewer gives up the last pretense of male identification. Abject terror may still be gendered feminine, but the willingness of one immensely popular current genre to represent the hero as an anatomical female would seem to suggest that at least one of the traditional marks of heroism, triumphant self-rescue, is no longer strictly gendered masculine. And then she ends the chapter by saying, does this mean that this is a subversive genre? And she's like, probably not as much as we want it to be, but is this something we need to continue thinking about for a very long time? Absolutely. And of course, she's writing this in 92. It's 2021. We are still thinking about these issues, so obviously she's very correct there. But it's that last statement, right, about the journey or the transformation of the final girl that I think is really important. And it's important in part because I think this is where we get to my one issue with Hendrix, and that is I don't think he entirely stuck the landing. And I think the landing is, for the final girl, one of the most important parts that has to be stuck really well for it to be subversive, and I just don't think it was quite there.
Yeah, I think it's because there's that weird... So much of the novel is establishing all of these people as being completely outside, isolated, and alone, and not trusting of each other. And so much of this novel is in that place, which I think is a very interesting place, because it leads to a lot of... These are all clearly dysfunctional people.
Yes.
Dysfunction in the sense that they are functioning around pain, rather. And so it leads to a lot of really amusing and dark interactions where they're just like exposing the worst of each other constantly. And so, but then in the final part of the novel, you see, it is a unique thing in that all of these final girls are coming together and having to work together to kind of take down these unconventional killers, which is something new, but you don't ever really get that transition where either they're clearly transitioning into something larger than themselves in this group and coming together to no longer... yes, they're outsiders, but they're insiders together. So and I think it's because there is that mishmash, which this is a disaffirmative text, but the trajectory of a final girl is to go on a journey of self-actualization. And so there's this tension between Hendrix's clear desire to want to actualize all of the final girls and give them the agency and give them that, if not happy ending, their journey needs to kind of come to a high point, but also him saying that the franchise and this idea that we keep going back to these stories is fundamentally kind of bad and kind of scary that we keep doing this, and yet then it wraps up in the same way as everything else. So there's like that tension between the central theme and the central journey of the final girl that is not ever really able to be properly, I think, I don't know. It's not, they don't ever quite fit in the ending.
And to be perfectly honest, I'm not sure what it would take to achieve that.
No.
Because one of the things that is frustrating but also fantastic about the book is that Lynette is a hot mess, and she's not going to stop being one. And it would be so inauthentic to everything that Hendrix is setting up and to the character if at the end she was like, but now I'm just going to be awesome and I'm going to push past my trauma, because that that would be wrong, right? That would be an incorrect way to do it. And so Lynette, until the very final moments, she's still like, I don't really want to do this. I guess I kind of have to. I'm not really pleased, but also I might lay down and die a little. So, that felt to me very authentic. And you're also right that, like, we have a dysfunctional family. And just like many families where you're like, why do you still interact with them if all you do is just ask them for money, or all they do is just ask you for money, and it's because we're family. The dysfunctionality of the support group was fantastic. And so it would have been super strange if at the end they had been like, we are Captain Planet together. When we come together, we can create magic, and, literal or figurative. It would have been really weird if it had become some sort of like montage of teamwork. Mm-hmm. Because even when Danny is like taking one for the team, there at the end, she's still not really doing it in like this like empowered way. It's more like, okay, well, I didn't want to stay alive really anyway, and also we just this is what we have to do. This is our fate. We have no choice. So I don't know how he would have resolved it, right? But there is that tension at work, and I think it's exacerbated by the proportion of the narrative, right? So much of this book is needing to set up Lynette's story. By the time we got to this final climactic moment at the camp and her realizing that it was stuff and all that, there wasn't enough book left.
It's only like the ending, which is technically a lot happens, because it's like they all have to go to the camp. They realize Sky and Steph were working together. They then have to defeat both of them separately in different things. And then once they do defeat them, then we also go to them to find out what has happened to all of them in their lives. And all of this is about 40 pages, which is 40 pages of a book that's 340 pages. So 300 pages is set kind of like messing with the world, and then 40 pages to the conclusion, which is, I think I agree with you. It's just, I think maybe it could have happened if it was over took maybe a bit more of time to just develop.
And, admittedly, Hendrix is making the argument kind of throughout this narrative that the least important things to us should be the deaths and the killings, and the most important parts should be the characters. But be that though it may, we could have spent some of that last time still having character development, or I don't know. Again, I'm not sure what would have needed to happen. I'm not sure how to do it. I just know that it didn't quite work.
And the ending was also something that was like really difficult for Hendrix. He's talked about in several interviews about how he originally wrote this book back in around 2014-ish, and he gave it to his agent, and his agent said, we can't sell this. No. And so he was like, okay, all right, let's put it away. And then COVID came around. He was isolated in his home, and he was like, and his agent was like, you got anything for me? And he was like, I got this book for you. And they're like, okay. And he was like, because he'd been working on it. He rewrote the ending, the last half. He completely scrapped what he had originally and rewrote the entire ending. So clearly he knew that ending was important, and he had been really trying to do it. And we may have come off a little too negative here. It still mostly works. It's like, it gets through the end of the slasher. It's just a bit abrupt, I think. And a bit abrupt in wrapping up the themes, and as well as the narrative, I think, that had been throughout the rest of the book kind of really, really seamlessly been weaving in and out of each other and working really well.
And you and I talked about this before we started recording a couple of days ago, actually, that this is his best book, and this is coming from someone who we've not disliked any of his books. This is his most complex. It's his most mature. It's interesting to me, and I know some people, I've heard some people articulate that they have problems with this, but I think it's just interesting that he's continuing all of his books have been from a main character who's female, and I think that this one is perhaps, maybe because of the nature of the final girl, but is perhaps his most realized or actualized character, followed by the main character in Southern Book Club.
Yeah, for sure. Another one of those brilliant, horrifying moments I thought was all of the stuff with Lynette's interactions with the police officer, which was just yet another one of those really good nods to like creepy elements that are in all slashers that maybe aren't necessarily explicitly acknowledged for how creepy
Yeah.
they are.
That the weird like paternal love interest.
Yeah,
Ugh.
where you're like, oh yeah, it is really creepy how much like in the slasher movies, like it's always like these like middle-aged dad characters who are the ones who are paired with the women. And then it was interesting to see Lynette, who is now no longer that young, that same young girl that she was when she first met the police officer, be forced to interact with him again, and
Yeah.
the simultaneous regression that she felt, and she hates
Yeah.
what's happening, but then they also like how their relationship has changed. And I thought it was
Yes.
brilliant, led to some really amazing interactions. And I
Yes.
did love at the end when when he was like, let's write that book. And she was like, I lied to you. And just walks away.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely correct that it was these like small moments within the big narrative that were so powerful and that really illustrate like if you can communicate that much in these small moments, it's just a sign of being a phenomenal writer. But to go back to the ending, because although you are correct that perhaps we sounded more harsh than we meant to, because obviously it didn't stop us from reading it, didn't stop us from liking it. My concern has to go back to what you accurately said, which is the disconnect or the tension that's happening between some of the affirmative and disaffirmative elements there at the end. And it has to do specifically with the Steph-Sky relationship. So
yeah,
I was excited that it didn't end up being the therapist because, he did a good job with that sort of red herring. I also thought having it be Sky was really interesting because we saw Lynette trust him. And so we saw that reminder that even if you've been in this situation, even if you're the most observant person you think you can be, you still can make mistakes, right? So I thought that was very interesting. And I liked the fact that we also had a female killer in there and the sort of like, I'm going to be the next gen version, right? That's very Scream-esque to me. But the very end of the book, which I really wanted to like, but I just didn't feel like it stuck the landing. The very, very end. I thought it was amazing that they went to the prison and were like, hey, it's time to have our final support meeting, final girl support group meeting, because you are a final girl too, to Steph in prison. My problem with that was, though, that there was this statement and this sort of implication, explicitly stated but also implied, that she had been groomed by Sky, right? I mean, it even says like that she'd been groomed by him. He was older and he had found her file and he had been manipulating her.
Lynette explicitly calls her out as like, you thought you were the subject, but you were really just an object.
Yes. And I had a problem with that because I think it would have been more interesting to have it be that she was the subject. She was the killer. She had groomed Sky. She's the one that had contacted him, all that stuff. And then say, but nevertheless, you are a final girl, because even though this one male character may not have manipulated you, you live in the society that we live in, where women, regardless of whether or not you think you have a sense of agency, you really don't. We are always treated as objects within the hegemonic sort of dominant society. That would have been more interesting to me, because then it would have been, you are not either a monster or a final girl, right? It would have been, you can be both, because that's the world that has been created for us.
Yeah, I think this is great, because it just, whereas throughout the whole novel he had been complicating the relationship between the monster and the final girl, in the end he then goes back to that very stringent separation between the monsters and the final girls, which kind of counteracts everything that we have read thus far. I kind of thought that the whole point of this book was like, we're kind of embracing and like reading about the monstrous elements of some of these final girls and how it has bad implications for them and their interactions with the rest of the world. But that doesn't mean they're any lesser, even if you have these monstrous tendencies. But then in the end, it's like, no, banish the monster. We got to get away from that. World's good. We're all final girls. kumbaya.
And I think, unfortunately, this is one of those places where it's doing a sort of disservice to this larger concept of female monstrosity, right? Because going back as far as, like, Medusa's a really good example. She has been reappropriated as this, like, feminist icon, or she's this ugly, grotesque monster.
Mm-hmm.
And she's either or, right? And that's just the way it is, and you get to pick. Instead of it being like, but can't she be both? Can't she be amazing because she's a monster, but also horrible because she's not a monster, right? Like, can't we just make it more complicated? And I think this is the one area where Hendrix, and I don't want to say it's because he's a male author writing a female character, because I don't really believe in that idea that that's why characters are limited. But I do think this is his one, like, writer character flaw, is that I'm thinking back to all of his main characters, and we just need, like, 10% more. Just 10% more complication to the character for us to really be in that space that I think he wants us to be, and the space that he takes us so close to being.
Yeah, because this is a similar complaint that we had kind of had about Southern, which is that it's so simplistic in terms of, like, its views of the gender binary. It's that, all of the women are very strong and good, and every single man is evil and bad. And not in a way where it's, like, in subtle ways where we're examining the extent that the patriarchy has had on these people and how no one can truly be happy under the patriarchy. It's just men are bad and women in this novel are very good.
Right. And not just good, but victims.
Right. And I think this novel, for 90% of it, is complicating that relationship and very effectively complicating it. And then only then in the last, like, 10%, it kind of, like, I guess is unable to bring all of that complications to satisfying conclusions, which I think makes sense given just the amount of ideas and the ideas that are at play in this novel. But it does lead to a bit of an underwhelming conclusion to a novel that had been so strong.
The good news is that if you liked this book, Hendrix has apparently, like, stepped up his writing timeline. He's already got his next book announced, and I'm personally rather delighted by the title. It's
called How to Sell a Haunted House, and it's coming out next July. It's July of 2022. So he had a book in July of 2021, and he's going to have a book for you next year. He's like the Marvel Cinematic Universe of horror writers. They're just pumping one out every year.
And I hope that he will continue one of my favorite things about him, which is that he plays with form as much as content. Either they look like IKEA magazines or VHS tapes, or in this case, all the ephemera. So there's going to be so much that to look forward to in terms of Hendrix in the future. But if you're listening to this podcast, there's also much to look forward to, because our next episode is going to be on
the 2010 remake of the Nightmare on Elm Street movie. I've never seen this one before. I love Nightmare. I have no idea what I'm going to think of this remake.
I know what you're going to think. So I'm really excited for that conversation so that I can tell you, I told you I knew what you were going to think. But I'm going to keep that secret, keep that safe until then, so as to not color your reading. But this will be bringing to a conclusion our examination of the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, which is just terribly exciting. And sad, but also terribly exciting, because we've been doing this for quite some time. So if you haven't watched the 2010 film, you should watch it, just so that you understand what we're talking about at the very least. And you should listen to all our episodes, right?
You should in the meantime, you should definitely listen to all of our episodes. Feel free to follow us on social media. Our links are in the description of this podcast.
Thank you for listening to our nightmares.
And have a spooktacular day.